Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Drive Pink Dialogue. This is Sunday. We haven't had an Inter Miami game in over a week. That is way too long, in my opinion, but we're going to talk about the Herons anyways. Mostly, we're going to focus on this upcoming summer transfer window, and we'll just talk about what's going on in Inter Miami's world. How you feeling tonight, man?
I'm feeling great. It's almost as if we timed this podcast perfectly because the Euros final just ended. I'm sure people will be talking about that as well. Good game, not too bad. And now the one last international final before we head back into club football, which is exactly what I'm excited about.
Yeah, preseason in Europe is starting in the next couple of weeks, but of course, we are in the smack dab middle of club soccer in the MLS. It was a fun weekend for Inter Miami fans, considering we had nothing to grab hold to. There was no game for Inter Miami, and yet every result seemingly went our way. I think we've gotten to the point of the season where there have been 6 teams that have separated themselves from the rest of the pack. 3 in the East, 3 in the West. Inter Miami smack dab in the middle of that Eastern Conference conversation alongside FC Cincinnati, who is 1 point ahead of us, and then a few points behind both of us, but with a few games in hand, the Columbus Crew. And then on the West Coast, it's the Galaxy, LAFC, and Real Salt Lake, all teams that have sort of separated from the rest of the MLS. Last night, all 5 of those teams played. 2 of them played each other, but 4 of them lost. The FC Cincinnati, coming off a major victory against Inter Miami, where they were all high and mighty and feeling great about themselves, fall to Charlotte FC 3-1. Talk to me about how you were feeling when you saw this result.
You know what? If anyone asks you what the MLS is like and how results in the MLS play out, show them this particular set of results, because it's like one moment you're winning the best game of your life against the hardest opponent, and then the next moment you're losing. So, and you're losing against an opponent that you would beat on any other day, and that's what happened with a lot of these teams. Charlotte beating Cincinnati was, not on my bingo card, but there you go, man. That's exactly what the MLS does. It brings you down to earth very quickly. And I'll be honest, it's hard to sustain that level of results consistently in MLS, especially when you go away from home. And it was bound to happen. I think Columbus is the next team that's in a really good run of form, and I'm expecting them to eventually fall to some random MLS team that's probably not even going to make the playoffs. But that's just the nature of the game, isn't it?
Yeah, and we did talk about in the pregame show for that Cincinnati game how they were going to get a little bit of a tougher schedule, and it started with Inter Miami, which they had no trouble with, but going to play Charlotte, even though that game was at home, they haven't been great at home. You could see some missteps in their future, and we got one right away. And then our other Eastern Conference opponent had no trouble, and that was the Columbus Crew, who went to LAFC and won 5-1 and sort of added insult to injury at the end. It was 3-0, and they said, we're going to push this all the way. They get a 5-1 victory at BMO Stadium, which is certainly no easy place to play. Columbus Crew, since we beat them a couple weeks ago, have gone on a 5-game winning streak and have outscored their opponents 20-2. If that's not a ridiculous run of form, I don't know what is. I said after that game that I think Inter Miami may have put them behind us and in the rearview mirror for the Supporter Shield table. I did not expect them to do what they have done, and they have been awesome. And so credit to them, but Inter Miami still has the lead. And and everyone else lost. Real Salt Lake lost. The LA Galaxy lost 2 games to Portland and FC Dallas that they shouldn't have lost. They had no business losing. And so Inter Miami sitting pretty after a day where they had no chance to pick up any points.
Yeah, Cincinnati, I believe, is still above us by a point, I think. But we're going to have, a reverse fixture at the Chase Stadium, and that's potentially going to be our opportunity to go back on top. But yeah, this was a really, really interesting set of results. I'm trying to see who Columbus played in the last few games since they played us. They played Sporting KC, New England, Nashville, Toronto, and LAFC. Well, it's a mixture of teams that they've played. some good, some bad, but it's a phenomenal result. And I'll pat ourselves a little bit on the back because we did a podcast midweek when Inter Miami wasn't playing one of the games, and we picked out the top 5 contenders who could potentially beat Inter Miami. And I believe the ones that we picked out were the ones that are currently leading the pack as well. So it's interesting, and I think that's who the playoffs going to come down to. These 4 teams that have sort of separated themselves from the pack, as you mentioned.
I will say about Columbus, and this is an interesting one. The last game they lost to a team that wasn't Pachuca, which is the team that won the CONCACAF Champions Cup, FC Cincinnati, or Inter Miami. So 3 of the teams that they're looking up at in terms of continental and in the MLS. Other than those 3 games, the last loss was on March 23rd against Charlotte. So they've been in great form against everyone else. And yet when they play the best teams, and listen, they've also beaten Monterrey twice. And so they have some big wins, LAFC, of course, this weekend. But they haven't beaten the teams that they need to beat to get over the top yet. So, I'll take that little bit of pride. Any other games this weekend that, caught your attention?
No, not really. I've actually been really focused on the international football side of things. So watched the Euro final. I'm looking forward to the Copa final. That's going to be interesting. And I don't have any particular favorite that I'm rooting for. So it'll be an interesting game. Hopefully Messi comes back injury-free. Saw the Uruguay game, which was the 3rd place game. Luis Suarez drawing it level for Uruguay in like the last few minutes. And then they go on to win on penalties. Great farewell for him as well. I think that was a fantastic way for him to cap off his international career. And I think he's going to be gunning. He's going to be ready to come back for Inter Miami and start scoring some goals as well. So those were the only few games that I've been looking out for.
Yeah, it was a game saving goal for Luis Suarez late, and he gets Uruguay to penalties. There was no extra time, and I thought Canada played really well. I thought in a lot of ways they deserved to win and they deserved that result, but they had an incredible tournament nonetheless. And so they're going to be proud, and Suarez gets to finish on a high note. He didn't have an incredible tournament. He had some sort of sloppy moments off the bench earlier on in the tournament. And so to get that goal, hopefully he comes back with a lot of confidence. And yeah, I think you said it right, to cap off an international career where I don't necessarily expect to see him again in the Uruguayan uniform. So awesome for him. And hopefully Lionel Messi can have a similar moment in the final tonight.
Yeah. Do you think this is going to be his last major international tournament for Argentina? Is he making that call for the final for the World Cup?
He's going to be at the World Cup. I have no doubt.
Really?
Yeah,
oh, man. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it happens. I just don't want him to be the player who sort of becomes washed by the time he's still playing for Argentina. And I don't know how that's going to play out with Messi, but I hope he retires gracefully and on top rather than, be dragged out on his knees. But that's a conversation that you can never really have, can you?
Yeah, well, listen, he's still the starting right winger, so it's not like he's a bench piece. Like Luis Suarez is a bench piece that got on the roster because there was some injuries, right? And that's a lot different of a situation than being the starter and star of the Argentine national team. So I think he'll go to the World Cup, but it's a long time from now, so we'll see. Let's get into the topic of the day, because we are 4 days away from the summer transfer window opening, and I haven't seen as much excitement about this window as I kind of expected, as I think there should be. And we're going to go through the 2023 summer transfer window, the 2024 summer transfer window, and we're going to talk about what Inter Miami could do in this transfer window and why it could be a little bit busier than a lot of people are expecting, because Inter Miami has a lot of flexibility, and there's no reason for them not to exercise that flexibility to create a team that they feel gives them the best chance to win the MLS Cup, to win the Supporters Shield, the Leagues Cup, etc. You excited?
I am excited. There are a lot of big names that was sort of floated around, linked into Miami. We obviously had Rafa Varane, who's one of the big ones. Sergio Ramos at one point, Angel Di Maria. Antoine Griezmann, I believe, was also one that was connected to Inter Miami. So there's been a few rumors, but nothing concrete. And I would have actually expected at this point in the window for rumors to have actually started becoming more concrete and more realistic in us pursuing some of our targets. So it seems like whatever targets we're pursuing is sort of kept under the radar. And I have a feeling that there's going to be a couple of surprises, players that we may not really know about or haven't heard about as much, who Inter Miami end up signing. But as long as we make the right decisions, pick the right positions that we need to strengthen, I'll be happy whoever we bring in. And it's going to be an interesting summer. I think transfer season is always fun to watch around, and it's really good to sort of get your heads around which players are up and coming and who's going to be brought in. So it's going to be an interesting conversation, an interesting summer ahead of us.
Yeah. Let's rewind to, let's say, December 2022. Inter Miami, 6 months earlier, had traded for Alejandro Pozuelo, and he came in, revolutionized that Inter Miami team, had a great connection with Gonzalo Higuain, and the two of them sort of led Inter Miami to the playoffs in 2022. It was the most successful period that the club had ever had at that point in time, certainly more than what they had done it previously to that moment. Higuain was incredible, 16 goals in like 16 games, something ridiculous like that. He was the superstar that we had paid him for the last 3 years to be. Pozuelo was clearly the catalyst for that change. Phil Neville got the team going. And then Inter Miami let him walk in that offseason. And at the time, it was really confusing because he was so good. We had DP spot available. We clearly thought this guy was the guy that we should have moving forward to help build this team, and that he was going to build a great connection with Leo Campana, etc. But we didn't. And the rumor became relatively quickly that we were saving that spot for Lionel Messi. And of course, at the time, it was sort of a pipe dream. He was at PSG. He was getting ready to win the World Cup. And Fabrizio Romano was telling us he was about to re-sign an extension with PSG. And there was always this idea that he might want to go back to Barcelona to end his career. And then a couple months later, we found out that he was offered $1 billion a year to go to Saudi Arabia, right? And to join Ronaldo and Conte and Benzema in that league. And so while it was interesting that Inter Miami was saving this spot for Lionel Messi, and that was a guy that we had heard was connected to Inter Miami and that we really wanted and we were trying to pursue and we were having conversations with, etc., it never felt like this was definitely going to happen until right before it happened. And that led us into a 2023 season with Phil Neville severely undermanned. We only filled one of our DP spots with a true full DP. Our other two DPs at the time, Gregory and Leo Campana. Campana was a U22. Gregory was a below max TAM player. And so Rodolfo Pizarro was the only DP on our roster. And we did that intentionally so that we could go have a huge program, club-changing 2023 season. And we suffered a lot in the first half of that season in order to make this happen. I've been talking for a while, but let me take you back to that moment. We were losing a lot of games. We had to fire our coach. We promoted an interim coach, and it was even worse. And yet we were just told, trust in this plan. How are you feeling about the club back then?
No. Don't take me back then, because that brings up the PTSD that I don't want to talk about. It was an interesting period because there was a lot of buzz around Inter Miami and a lot of conversations and rumors about who we want to bring in. But at the same time, football is a game of results, right? You want to be able to perform at that point in time. And hindsight 2020, we had to go through the downs and it had to get much worse before it actually started getting better. And now I think we can look back on that period as something that this club as a whole had to go through to be able to get to where it is right now. And as they say, trust in the process, be patient, and good things will come to those who wait. And hey, as long as Inter Miami makes that playoff final, and as long as we win that MLS Cup and the Leagues Cup and every other cup that's available, the Supporters Shield, everything under the sun with Lionel Messi, I won't even care about what happened in those few years with Phil Neville and the rest.
Okay, well, the reason I wanted to bring everyone back to that moment is because Inter Miami had intentionally kept a lot of flexibility in order to add not just 3 DPs or potentially 3 DPs, but also potentially 3 U22 DPs, as long as they could configure a way to keep Leo Campana. And so what they did was add Lionel Messi, as we found out last June, a little over a year ago, added Sergio Busquets, added 3 U22 DPs, bought down Leo Campana. I believe at the time, Tom Bogert reported on this. And so he was under the DP threshold. And Inter Miami was able to make it all work by maxing out the roster flexibility that they had last summer to bring in Lionel Messi, Sergio Busquets, Jordi Alba, plus the 3 U22s, Diego Gomez, Toto Aviles, and Facundo Farias. They maxed it out. And I think that's important to say, and it's important context for when we talk about this summer transfer window, because even though they had those specialty spots available and they kept international roster slots available for that, and they got a lot of allocation money for that, they didn't have a ton of flexibility elsewhere in the roster. There was a lot of players that we would consider not living up to their paycheck, players that maybe didn't fit into the future of Inter Miami, guys like Chris McVeigh, Nico Stefanelli, Coco Jean, Gregory, John Mota, DeAndre Yedlin, guys that were a part of the roster, making significant money, hard to move players in the middle of the season and still rebuild your team. So yes, they had the DP ability to add 2 DPs because they ended up moving on from Rodolfo Pizarro. They ended up moving on from Nick Marsman. But really, they maxed out what they could do. And it was awesome, and they won the Leagues Cup, and it was incredible moment. But it wasn't until the winter that they were able to really reshape the roster in an effective way, because again, all those players I just mentioned were not part of Tata Martino's plans, not part of his future. And so there was a need to cull the roster in order to create flexibility for what they had going into the winter window. And that's exactly what they did. They let José Martinez walk. They let Victor Joa walk. They let Dixon Arroyo walk. I guess it was Joa retired, but then they traded Kamal Miller. That was a big deal when it happened. Really surprising. Kind of came out of left field, but they wanted to get the international roster slots. They wanted to get the excessive allocation money in order to build this roster. They ended up later on trading Chris McVeigh, trading DeAndre Yedlin, selling Nico Stefanelli, selling Gregory, selling Coco Jean, selling Jean Mota. Okay, you get the idea. And they did that in order to bring in another really big transfer window. And that was Luis Suarez, Julian Gressel, Nico Frede, Federico Redondo, Marcelo Wigan, Matias Rojas. They drafted Yannick Bright and Leo Fonzo, who have also become impact players on this team. The point I'm trying to make is that I think over the last 2 transfer windows, they've had A, transformative transfer windows, and B, they've maxed out the flexibility that they could with the roster that they had in order to build the best possible team. How do you feel about that statement that I just made?
I'm trying to think if any other team in the MLS has had such a transformative transformative last 2 windows as Inter Miami did, because these are a lot of incomings and a lot of outgoings. As fans, sometimes it's really hard to understand why certain moves are being made. When Kamal Miller was traded, I'm sure you and I had both the same reaction of, why is this happening? Because he's a great defender, and it doesn't seem ideal to move on one of our best players, right? One of our best center backs. Similarly, with a few other players, I still remember having that conversation when we started the podcast about Gregory. All the changes that were happening, moving on Yedlin as well. We were trying to figure out what's the process behind that. And that's just to say that it's really hard to figure out as fans, unless you get into the weeds of it, of why certain moves are being made, because it seems like there are a lot of different chess pieces being moved to get to a certain point in time. And this transfer window for me sort of completes that process that began, I believe, in winter 2023, right? It seems like we're finally headed towards a period where we're going to be able to say, yes, this is a collective that we can be not proud of, but also this is the collective that we wanted to put together for someone like Lionel Messi to be able to play around with and to bolster our squad to the best possible outcome in every single position. And I think we've seen a lot of it in this particular season itself, where our depth in certain positions is absolutely unmatchable. But there's always a question about whether we are at our full potential. And I don't think so, because there are positions that we really need to strengthen and that we really need to get better at. And I feel like this next window, maybe perhaps one more window, but I would say this next window is crucial for us to finally reach our final form, if that's to say correctly, right?
Yeah, and listen, they built a lot of flexibility, and we'll get into that. But I've had a lot of conversations with people over the last couple of weeks about what this transfer window might look like, and I'm sure some of you guys have heard those on the Heartbeat ad. But I've gotten a surprising answer from most of everyone I've talked to, and they kind of expect it to be a more conservative transfer window than I'm expecting. They have generally said, let's go get a center back. And if there's a big star that we can get, do that. And, we've heard the names Angel Di Maria or Rafael Varane or whoever, but that's kind of been the limit of what I've heard and what people expect. And that surprises me, because it doesn't feel like, based on the two transfer windows we've just had, that Inter Miami is going to leave material on the table if they feel like they can improve their roster. And again, going back to this winter, I think the reason they didn't transform the roster more is because they found it very difficult to move players off the roster, that they ended up moving off the roster, but right at the very end of the window, which didn't give them a lot of time. But even still, after moving those players off the roster, they were still able to add Chelo Wigan and Matthias Rojas coming right before the window closed. So I've gotten the sense over the last two windows, Inter Miami is going to be aggressive. They're going to be ambitious. They're going to attack, and they're going to use all the flexibility they have to build this roster into something that they feel is the best in the MLS, the best in North America, something they can be proud of for the foreseeable future, and that will win trophies with Lionel Messi. How are you feeling about where this summer window might be headed from an Inter Miami's front office perspective?
You use a lot of really good adjectives to describe how Inter Miami has been functioning in the transfer window, but one that I would add to that is unemotional. It feels like a lot of the business that we've done has been very unemotional, very pragmatic, and as you mentioned, that we're not going to lose the opportunity to try and improve our roster wherever we can. That being said, how am I feeling about this particular transfer window? Very, very excited, because I feel like there are certain positions that have now become quite evident where we need to improve on. I do think the transfer window, I do think the club management is actually looking at this transfer window with specific ideas and specific positions in mind where they want to bolster. So that's always great to know that strength is coming, and moving into the next half of the season where we're going to be needing a lot more, we need to be a lot more clinical in practically every area of the pitch. It's going to be interesting to see who they pick to try and bolster our squad, and I'm specifically referring to the center back position here. And then also I'm interested to see what other areas we might consider and who we might end up losing. Could it be Leonardo Campana, who we might want to, who they might carry out, who might leave? Robert Taylor perhaps might be another player that might get taken out of the club as part of our transfer strategy. I'm not sure. I feel like there's going to be one of those surprises where a fan favorite might get caught up in this transfer circle, and we might end up losing somebody that we really fancy. And it'll be interesting to see what surprises are in store and who comes in. But there's a lot of question marks over which position or which players are going to come in, and that's always exciting for any fan of a club.
Yeah, listen, Chris Henderson has made no bones about being willing to move the roster, move guys off the roster, turn the roster over. It feels like we have a dozen new players every season. And while most of that work has come in the winter window, in the preseason, obviously we saw last season was an exception. And so it wouldn't surprise me to see Inter Miami do a lot of work this window to try and build this roster moving forward. One of the things that we've talked about a lot, and that is evident with this Inter Miami team, is it's incredibly deep. Sure, we don't have an incredible backup goalkeeper, but basically everywhere else we have a 2 deep that we're relatively comfortable with at striker, at both wing spots, in the midfield, at left back, at, well, maybe with the injury, not as comfortable at center back with the injury to Frede, but and then with Ian Frey coming back, we feel good about two right backs. So it's an incredibly deep team, but a lot of that comes from Inter Miami's ability to produce academy products and Inter Miami's ability to succeed in the super draft, which we did basically for the first time back in December by bringing in Yannick Bright and Leo Alfonso. And then the academy prospects that, have really impacted the team, Ian Frey, David Ruiz, Benjamin Kramaski, guys like that. And what that has done has masked the fact that Inter Miami's roster is not as full as people think it is. I'm just going to go on a 2-minute monologue to set the groundwork, set the table for the rest of our conversation. But basically, you are allowed to have 20 players on your senior roster. And that's the group of players that has to fit within the salary cap. They have to fit with the international roster slots. They have to fit with the DPs and U22 DPs and all of that. And then you get another set of 10 on it's called the supplemental roster. And these are your academy players and your draft picks. And if I'm boring you guys, I apologize. But the point of this conversation is that you can still fill up that 20-man senior roster slot with new players for the next rest of this window and add really quality players. And I think there's a lot of flexibility to do that. At this moment, Inter Miami is sitting at 18 players on that senior roster, meaning they already have 2 spots available. I think that it makes a ton of sense to use your buyout on Nico Frede because he's done for the season and he's on loan anyways. So his time in Inter Miami would make sense for it to end in the next couple weeks, which would open up a 3rd spot on the senior roster. It would also open up a lot of salary cap charge, and it would open up an international roster slot. We've heard that Diego Gomez is a player that could be on the move out. If he does, it would open up another international roster slot. It would open up a U22 spot. It would open up a lot of, you'd bring in a big salary, a big transfer fee rather, to fund whatever you want to do moving forward. I'll talk about another trade candidate that I think would add some more. And then also I think Inter Miami has the opportunity to buy down Leo Campana. And so if they do that, they would have 4 senior roster slots. They would have a U22 spot. They would have a DP spot, and they would have 2 international roster slots to work with. This is a lot of flexibility for a team that is seemingly as complete as Inter Miami is, that's seemingly as well resourced in terms of its depth as Inter Miami is. And yet they can still go out and add 4 players, including some high profile U22 type players. You can go get players from overseas. You can go add impact players like Matias Rojas or Chelo Wiegand using those international roster slots. There is a lot of potential flexibility in this roster that you can take advantage of right now in order to make this team the best it can be for the Leagues Cup knockout stages and for the MLS Cup run. I've talked for a lot there, but how does that make you feel knowing that there's a ton of flexibility already built into this roster?
I mean, that's really smart business sense from Chris Henderson, Tata Martino, and everyone in the management, because they've really thought about how they want to construct this team. And I remember last transfer window, it was a lot of question marks from a lot of different journalists, other teams, about how Inter Miami is conducting some of these moves. And when some of the information became public about how much we are paying to certain players, who's on what salary cap, it was actually really, really positive to see how well this roster has been constructed, because there are a fair few surprises. I know we didn't expect Freire and Christoph to be on the wages that they were. I believe Christoph was a TAM position as well. Obviously, some surprises here and there, but overall, it seemed like all the pieces had fit in really, really well. And not just for this particular season, but moving on, it seems like they have a transfer strategy and plan where a lot of our players are on 2-year contracts. Some of their contracts are ending, 1-year option to extend in some of the players. So it doesn't seem like it's a bloated roster by any means. If we want to move on certain players, I feel like there's a lot of flexibility. And you've already mentioned a few players that might be in contention for a trade, might be in contention for moving on. And the fact that we already have 2 open slots. I know the injuries come into play to Facundo Farias, and Nico Freire as well is now on the injury list, and a few, that always helps, because now we have to go into the market and fill up those gaps that have been left by these injured players. But overall, it just seems like a very well constructed squad. My only worry is I'm always a big advocate for stability and continuity, and it just seems like there are a lot of moving pieces still, and I have a feeling that this transfer window, we're going to have a fair few incomings and outgoings. And by fair few, I mean at least 2, 3, and maybe even 4. And when that happens, especially at this crucial stage in the season, whoever we bring in has to kick the ground running, because we're at a point in time where the team chemistry seems really, really good. So they don't necessarily have the luxury of fitting in, taking their time to fit in. And it's going to be a quick transition for a lot of the incoming players. So we need to focus on bringing in players who are high quality and who can immediately slot into the positions that we're buying them for and make an impact immediately, because it's not the start of the season where we can be like, okay, a fair few games we can spend building team chemistry and then worry about getting the points. We need to do well right now, immediately. So I just worry that some of the transfer choices that we make, or just by virtue of the transfer window coming in at the point that it does, it might destabilize the team, at least in the short term. But that, I think, is just a collateral that comes in from any new signings, right? So I don't know how big the changes are going to be. I don't expect them to be super monumental, but at least a fair few coming in.
So you think maybe it's not a good idea to bring in too many new players?
No, it's not. It's not about bringing in too many good players. I think it's about who we bring in and what kind of positions that we bolster, right? So if you're letting go of Diego Gomez, then the under 22 that you bring in, for instance, if you plan to replace him for like to like, you want to bring in somebody who can have the same level of impact as Diego Gomez, right? Or maybe somebody who's going to be playing in for the future. But that does definitely leave a gap, because Diego Gomez is a big player for this team. So to be able to replace someone like a Diego Gomez, you need to bring in a similar sort of equality or potential of equality. And then similarly in defense, if you're letting go of Nico Freire, you need to bring in somebody who can actually make a difference in that back line. You don't want to bring in somebody who's going to be, a bench warmer, who's going to be sitting in. I'm sure that's not going to be the case.
I understand. In this case,
I
understand.
Yeah.
But I guess that's not really the point I was trying to make earlier, where Inter Miami has tried to max out what they can do, and they've done a good job of that. And now they find themselves not maxed out. And so I'm thinking there's a possibility that if Inter Miami maxes out, that could mean they're adding a U22 center back, they're adding a DP center back, they're adding a winger, and they're adding a defensive midfielder. Like 4+ players, and not all have to be starters, not all have to be sort of immediate contributors or impact players, but trying to bolster the roster for the stretch run. But from you, I'm also hearing, and this is sort of what has felt like the general sense from most people that I've talked to, that it's really just bringing in one player who's the right player, or bringing in maybe 2 players that's the right players. Is that what you're expecting?
Honestly, I don't know what to expect with this team, because they always tend to surprise us. But yeah, I think it's going to be more a case of bringing in 1 or 2 really solid players who bring this team up to a level that we're expecting this team to be at, especially in that center back position. Maybe in the midfield, we have another person who levels us up a little bit. But apart from that, I feel like it's going to be a lot of backup pieces and depth options rather than big money signings that you mentioned, us bringing a winger, 2 center backs, one under 22, one DP. I don't know if that's going to be the case or not. We'll see. But I have a feeling it's going to be 2 really good, solid pieces that can level the team up, and then the rest is going to be more depth options in case we need to, dig into our bench a little bit.
Okay, just curious. Let's talk about center back because they need a center back. They're going to get a center back. The club has made it clear that they're going to get a center back. They haven't been linked to a ton of players that we've heard about. So, we have no idea who that's going to be, but they think they have someone lined up. They think they have a couple people lined up that they can get. And so we should expect, as Inter Miami fans, for the club to go get a real veteran, talented center back that can just lock in and be a locked-in starter for this team. What Inter Miami thought they were getting in Nico Frede, but potentially an upgrade, potentially the same type of player. We'll see. Once that's done, and let's just assume that happens early on in the window, do you think Inter Miami's sort of like, okay, we did what we had to do. Let's just, see if any opportunities come up, but then we're done if that's the case?
No, I think it's going to be 2 players at least. I do think they're going to go for 1 attacking option and then 1 center back option. And then, as you mentioned, there are a couple of outgoings that might be happening as well. For someone like Diego Gomez to leave, you'd have to replace him, right, in some form or another. I don't know whether it's going to be a life-for-life replacement because we've got so much depth in the midfield, but at least for the next stretch of games, you want to be able to fill that gap, right? You don't want the under 22 spot just lying around. So if we can fill that spot, we'll definitely look to fill it up. So it really depends on what the incomings, outgoing structure looks like. But I do think the focus at first is going to be the center back, then maybe a forward option. And then we're going to figure out what the outgoing situation is like to then bring in anyone else that we plan to. And again, this is all conjecture. I am really just my understanding of how this roster has been built. But we'll see what happens. Surprise is always good, I think.
Yeah. Let's talk about the U22 spot because I also don't know. They don't have to fill it, right? Because there's always that overhanging Facundo Farias, not a problem, but he's still there. He's on he's on the season-ending injury list, so he's not going to be available for this season, but he will be back in January for the roster, or March or whenever the season starts, and will have to occupy a U22 spot. You still have Toto Aviles, you still have Federico Redondo, and so even if you do sell Diego Gomez, you're still 1 spot. You're now at the right amount. In fact, you're actually 1 over because Emerson Rodriguez is out there somewhere, and so they don't have to fill that U22 spot. I think that you could see them do that with a striker for the future. I think you could see them go get a center back with that spot. And I sort of tend to believe they're going to use it because they want to maximize what they can do. And if they have to move on Toto Aviles in the winter in order to make it happen, or Facundo Farias, like they can do that then. Or it's just selling Federico Redondo, who said, I want to come in and play for 1 year, and then I want to go to AC Milan or Real Madrid or wherever he was destined to go anyways. Like, I don't think it's a problem to have 1 extra U22 on the roster if you end up selling Diego Gomez, but they might not use it and just save it for Facundo Farias later on. Is that what you're expecting? I guess, I know I keep asking if this is what you're expecting, but I guess I would be disappointed if that's what their plan was.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at earlier as well, right? Like, if you have that spot available at this point in the season, you might as well use it, right? Because it's just going to be sitting there idle, not being used. Doesn't make any sense. You want to be able to go into this next stretch of games, and we keep talking about this next stretch of games because we're potentially going to be making a playoff run that's going to be quite deep, or we expect it to be quite deep. And you want to use and maximize your roster out in the best possible manner. For me, the best case scenario is to get a DP center back and use that under 22 to get a U22 center back as well, because that's just going to really help us get depth in an area that we don't necessarily have depth in. That for me is going to be fantastic. Do we think that's what's going to happen? I'm not sure. I have a feeling what's going to happen is if someone like Diego Gomez leaves, is going to be a like for like U22 replacement, and then we're going to get a DP center back. That's my understanding. But again, a lot of question marks over how we're going to proceed and how we're going to approach this transfer window, because we have so much flexibility at the end of the day. It's not set in stone. So interesting time all around.
Yeah, I also think if you do free up that U22 spot, you can use it in a lot of interesting ways. You could go get that extra winger that you wanted, right? You could go get a striker for the future, and then all of a sudden next season you could have Campana and the future striker if Suarez retired, and you already have your two strikers for next year. And then, like you said, you can go get a center back. I'm a little hesitant on a U22 center back just because I think Tota Aviles is like as good of a U22 center back as you're going to get, and as we've seen, he's still raw, and so I don't know if you're going to get the finished product that we want.
Yep.
But that's also a possibility, of course. I don't think we're going to get a box-to-box midfielder, but maybe a U22 10, like a really talented attacking midfielder, right? Atlanta went out and got Thiago Almada a couple years ago. If we went out and got a player like that and used him on a U22 spot, I would love that. I do want to talk about the midfield in a little bit, but let's swing it around to outgoings. I think there's a number of players that could be on the way out. And so not necessarily that they will be, but I think are on the table if the right move makes sense for Inter Miami. We've heard a lot about Robert Taylor, and that makes sense because he's on the last year of his contract. And so it's sort of an easy move with a lot of upside for another team if they're trying to make a run and they need a winger. Leo Campana on that DP spot. A lot of teams would like him. And again, as I mentioned, if you move Leo Campana, but then you use his spot, like a U22 spot, to bring in another striker, you could see how that could make sense. Sergei Kristov, a guy I'm sure Inter Miami would love to move if they could find a buyer to take him. And then the last one, and I want to talk about this, is Franco Negri, who has been on my radar all season as a trade candidate in this summer window. We have seen him prove that he is a talented enough left back to be a starter in this league. And so if you're in the MLS and you need a left back for this season, you can go get Franco Negri. He won't cost a lot in terms of his salary charge. And Inter Miami has a starter that we've seen in Jordi Alba is going to play 90 minutes whenever he's available. There's no rotation there. There's no let's get Franco Negri 8 minutes off the bench if we're winning just because we trust him as a professional. And
we have Noah Allen to, like, in case we need to bring him off at like 60 minutes or something. Yeah.
Right. And so even though Franco Negri, I think we both agree, is above Noah Allen, because you're using any backup left back so infrequently, Noah Allen's more than capable of handling that role. I think this is an incredible trade piece for Inter Miami to clear some space, bring in some allocation money, but more importantly, free up an international roster slot. We've already talked about how they could easily free up 2. This would give them a 3rd international roster slot. And all of a sudden, again, without going too far out of the way, you can see how this team can open up 5 spots on the roster, multiple international roster slots, a U22 spot, a DP spot. Like, I see this in front of me, and I think to myself, there's no way this couldn't be a big summer transfer window. Like, Inter Miami should feel like we have a ton of room to maneuver. Let's just start with Franco Negri. Am I off base? Am I crazy? Or does this feel like something that makes a lot of sense?
There's a couple of questions that keep coming up whenever we talk about how much flexibility we actually have as a team and how much we can actually do in this window. And that's what I was trying to get at earlier as well, but potentially didn't articulate it well enough. It's not about what we can actually do, because as you mentioned, we have a lot of flexibility in how many players we can bring in, who we can trade out, and some of the positions that we might want to, improve on. It's more of a question of, do we want to do this right now at this point in time, or do we want to wait until the end of the season? Because it seems like the team right now, unlike in the previous seasons, is on a really good path forward, and we're on an upward trajectory.
But hold on, let me stop you, because Tata Martino did say after our last game that he didn't think we were the best team in MLS. He didn't even think we were in the top 3. So if the coaching staff and the front office don't believe that Inter Miami is the best team in the league, you have to do something while you have Lionel Messi in order to change that. And so maybe I should have started with this conversation, but or that like fact, but like we just got beat 6-1 against Cincinnati. And yes, we were missing some starters, but we could be missing starters in the playoffs. You have to try and win this year no matter what, because you have Messi now, right? I feel like everyone is taking this so
right?
lackadaisically. And I'm like, you have to go. And you've created flexibility. I apologize. What's up?
No. That's completely understandable. And this is obviously a really interesting topic for us to discuss as well, because we might have different understandings of how we want this roster to play out. But here's my question to you, right? So if you were in charge of Inter Miami at this point in time, and you see the amount of flexibility that you have, do you exercise all of it and you try and build up the best possible roster? Or do you be a little bit more pragmatic where you're like, okay, I'm going to improve positions where I know we need to improve, and the other areas are we're actually really good at those. So for instance, in the attack, right, I don't necessarily see how we can improve unless we get someone like a superstar Angel Di Maria in. I don't necessarily see who else we get in that improves this particular squad. So that's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, so let me give you some potential ways to improve this roster. And again, I love this team. I think it's an incredibly deep team with talent all over the field. I absolutely think that 100%. And I think actually, unlike Tata, I think this is the most talented team in the MLS, at least when everyone's available and healthy, which hasn't been a ton this year. You can add a number 10 to this roster, like a real talented number 10, like a Thiago Almada. And you can do that with your DP spot or your U22 spot. I think Tata Martino would love another 6 in case he wants someone with more experience than Yannick Bright, or he just doesn't feel like Yannick Bright is there yet. I think he would love a number 6. And I know we talk about how many midfielders we have, but tell me this team has a true number 10 that can dominate games like Lucho Acosta, or tell me this team has a true number 6 like even a Dixon Arroyo or Gregory. We only have Yannick Bright, and I'm sure Tata Martino would love another one of those when we need it. And I haven't even talked about the defense yet, where we need a true number 1 center back. We could plausibly use 2 starting center backs and then maybe a backup right back if you don't love Ian Frey there. So it doesn't seem hard to, and also we talked about Angel Di Maria. Maybe you want to add another wing option, because even though I personally feel really good about the 4 wingers we have in Messi, Rojas, Taylor, and Julian Gressel when he plays up there, like I feel good about that, but you could see how they could want another winger, because we have seen Leo Alfonso play a lot recently. I just named like 5 or 6 ways where you could improve this roster, and you have 4, 5, 6 roster spots in order to try and improve the roster. So again, am I crazy, or does it feel like Inter Miami could, if things work their way, have a really big transformative window? And again, maybe I'm crazy. I feel like I'm the only one saying this, but it feels like it's right there.
I think it's all about philosophy. Let's take it deep, right? Because I feel like this team is away from 1 or 2 good signings to be among that top 3 team in the league. And yes, I completely agree with Skrilla. We may not be the top team right now on paper, because we don't necessarily have the best defense, and maybe the midfield is a little bit iffy. If we put in 1 number 6 and 1 defender or 1 center back in, I think this team can go on to beat any team in the MLS. But I get your point, right? This is the moment where you want to be like, I don't want to leave any ifs and buts on the table. So if you have the potential to improve this team to the best possible scenario, to create the super team that you're looking to create, to ensure that 6-1 against Cincinnati never happens again. When we go into the playoffs, we're not the team where everyone's like, oh, yes, they do have the potential, but are they going to reach it? But instead, we're the team where everyone's like, yeah, Inter Miami's blowing everyone out of the water, right? So I would get your point with, yes, build this up to the best possible potential when you have the means to do it. And why just, be very conservative in bringing up only 1 or 2 players in, and then be like, okay, yeah, we are a really good team, but maybe on our day we might lose to another really good team in the MLS. So I get your point about going all the way in and just making the best possible super team that you can. But at the same time, I'm not sure what the situation is going to be like there.
No, but is the only thing stopping us from doing that like our inability to imagine it actually happening? Because we have the roster flexibility, we have some money, we have designations in the DP and U22. Like it feels like it's there, and it feels like we're only being held back because we can't imagine us actually doing that because of how deep this roster is. But it's right there, and I feel like we should, have the freedom to dream and let loose and do everything we can to make this happen. We just watched the Columbus Crew beat LAFC on the road 5-1. Like, yes, we beat them at home, but what if we have to go to their place in the playoffs? And what if we have to go to at Cincinnati in the playoffs? And what if we have to go to at LAFC or, like if you're Inter Miami, you want to make it not so that you think you can win, but that you are the absolute favorites in every single game. And right now, if we played Cincinnati on the road, we wouldn't be the favorites. We wouldn't be the favorites. If we played Columbus this week, we wouldn't be the favorites. So, okay, even if we fast forward 3 weeks and when Messi and Suarez are back, like I still don't know if we would be the favorites. We would be even or whatever, but it wouldn't be like, oh, Inter Miami should go in and win that game 3-0. But if you can turn your team into that, why wouldn't you? I feel like I'm going crazy because everyone feels like.
I think you put across a good point here, and that's what I'm saying. Like it depends on what the philosophy is, right? If this is the philosophy of, okay, we're really good in all of the places, we need 2 good signings, and then we can go out and compete. Or is the philosophy, you know what, we're great, but we need to be even better, and to do that, we need to be pragmatic, build up in every single possible way that we can. And the more I think about it and the more I listen to you talk, and this is what happens, right? Crazy breeds crazy. The more I listen to you talk, it feels like the way this roster has been set up is we're trying to get to that final one big push. And we wouldn't have had this much flexibility if it wasn't created by choice, right? So
yes.
So
thank you.
The potential is that we might actually have this much flexibility in place to actually go out and do something quite interesting, where we have 3 big transformative windows, one after the other. But again, this might be just a pipe dream of crazy 2 people talking on a mic every single week. Yeah,
we should definitely retitle this episode "Crazy Breeze Crazy." But it feels like it's right there. It does feel like it's right there. And listen, I know you have to go convince players, and it's not as easy anymore because you don't necessarily have an automatic starting spot, and it's not the off season in Argentina where you were getting a lot of players that wanted to come play with Messi. I get all of that. I get it's not as easy, but feels like you should try. Let's talk about this third DP spot. And the graphic for this episode had Weston McKennie because we heard his name over the last couple of days linked to Inter Miami, and we can talk about him in a second. But basically, the MLS teams get 3 DP spots, but up until even and including today, you have to have one of those DP spots be a specific type of DP in order to unlock all 3 U22s. Because Inter Miami wanted to unlock all 3 U22s, they had to keep Leo Campana as a DP because he fit that specific qualification. That rule is changing when the window opens on Thursday or Wednesday or July 18th, whichever's that day. And so Leo Campana no longer has to be a DP in order to activate all 3 U22s. So Leo Campana can be moved on. He can be bought down. He can be bought out. They're not going to buy him out, but let's assume Leo Campana at this time a week from now is no longer a DP. He's bought down. Let's just say he's bought down. You have to fill the third DP spot, right? Like, even if we're talking about just adding one big player, you have to fill the DP spot if you can, and they should be able to. Right? Am I crazy for thinking that? Like, feels like obvious.
That has to happen, right? And whether that's a center back, whether that's a midfielder, whether that's a striker, I'm not sure what position we're going to look at. But that, like, you have to fill up your DP spot, because when you have, again, this is a matter of when you have it, why not use it? And this team is screaming out for another big quality player. right? We've got obviously Lionel Messi, who's a DP, Leo Campana is a DP, and Sergio Busquets is a DP as well. If I'm remembering it correctly, Luis Suarez is not a DP, which is surprising. Jordi Alba is not a DP. So yes, we need a marquee signing, and that's how you go out and get it, right? That's exactly how you use it.
Okay, so let me ask you this before we talk about specific players. Let's theorize about
defense.
Okay. No, fair. Let's theorize about potential positions you could use this DP spot on. Listen, I had a conversation on the Heartbeat earlier this week where someone asked me, would you even use a DP spot on a center back in the MLS? And so, like, that's a philosophy that's out there, that you don't use a DP spot in the MLS. Nashville does it with Walker Zimmerman, and yes, he makes a huge difference, but also they're not a team competing to win the East, right? So does that make sense? And maybe before we even talk about positions, we should ask this question. Does the DP you sign have to be for this team in this moment for this year? Or is it possible that you go get a DP that actually would make a difference over the next 3 or 4 years, which is probably the traditional way to get a DP? Or, do you want one that fits this team to help you win this year?
Fits this team to help us win this year, right? Right? This is
it.
This is the best possible chance that we potentially have to win the cup. So
maybe I should explain what I mean there, just for everyone else.
Yeah.
If you went out and got a central midfielder, maybe like Weston McKennie, yes, he would make your team better. Yes, he would be your best midfielder. But also, this team's biggest need is in defense. So, like, he doesn't necessarily make sense. But over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, Weston McKennie would be a huge transformative piece. But for this specific roster, maybe he's not the biggest need. Okay. With that said, and Skrilla makes a point. And again, when I say this about using a DP on defense, it's traditional thinking in the MLS. Don't use a DP on center back. And oftentimes the teams that do end up not being at the top of the table. So this is a very specific question for this team and this roster in this situation, but that is a thought out there. And you, when I was about to ask you, said defense. You think it has to be a center back?
Yeah, if you think about it, right? If you had to bring in someone like a Rafa Varane, I know that's not going to happen anymore, but if that was the case, and the only way he was going to come in was through a DP spot, 100%, no doubt, like, I would use that DP spot to bring in Rafa Varane. That's like signing the best striker in the league as well. It's the same thing. I don't think the idea that spending okay, so the MLS traditionally has this idea, and you've touched on this a little bit, that you build up your front line with superstars, you build up your midfield with superstars, and then the defense sorts itself out. But when you already have a set of superstars in your front line and your midfield, and your team is crying out for a big, solid defensive presence in there, why not use it on a DP there, right? Why not bring in the best possible defender in MLS history if you can? I know Rafa Varane's not going to happen, but if someone similar to that ilk shows up on the market and you're able to bring them in as a DP, and if they're not coming in with any other position, then you offer them that DP spot, right?
Okay, well, let's back down from Rafael Varane, who is one of the best center backs in the world. Let me ask you a hypothetical question. If I told you we were going to sell Diego Gomez and we were going to get a striker, a young 21-year-old striker, would you then trade Leo Campana for Walker Zimmerman, who is a DP? And Nashville is rebuilding and resetting. Would you make that move?
I would say so. But again, Walker Zimmerman might not be the best candidate for the future. But at this point in time, what this team needs, like, what's the biggest thing that's stopping us from beating Cincinnati, right? We shipped 6 goals against them. Scoring has not been an issue for this team. That's clear. We need to sort out our defense. And if we need to spend that DP spot to bring in that defensive presence to improve our squad there, why would you not want to have a DP in the back and the DP in the front? So for me, I think defense wins games, right? If you're able to use that DP spot to bring in a superstar defender, do it. Moises Bambito, I would bring him in immediately.
Well, he's not a DP, but yeah, I hear what you're saying. Let's talk about other potential spots because we heard Angel Di Maria. Would you bring in a world-class left winger in order to give yourself even more offensive firepower? And again, you will have other roster slots in order to try and improve the defense. They're going to try and improve the defense. You don't have to use the DP in order to improve the center back position. Do you think that is a potential spot? Superstar left winger?
Yeah, I think that would be a great spot to fill in. I know Robert Taylor has been a little bit iffy since we did that rankings and I put him in number 3. It feels like I've cursed him a little bit, but he produces from time to time, right? He scores goals, but it's not prolific by any means.
He's a good MLS winger for sure.
He's a great MLS winger, but if you can have someone who's off the Angel Di Maria space, because what that does is that brings in a player who is so dangerous, and then you have Messi who's dangerous, Suarez who's dangerous, and then a left wing who's dangerous. It'll be insane. So
what about a number 10, like a true Kevin De Bruyne or even a Thiago Almada type number 10?
Yeah, I think it does something very similar to this team. But the only worry that I have with the number 10 is that they need to learn how to play with Lionel Messi. Because he often occupies that number 10 position, even though he's playing as a right winger. He plays very centrally from time to time. So you need to have somebody who can really link up with Lionel Messi. And honestly, I don't mind having Matthias Rojas in there because at least he showed in the first couple of games that he's good in linking up and understanding.
This conversation anywhere but center back is not about do we have any options there? We have quality across the roster, but if you can get a superstar, incredible type player, right? We just watched what Lucho Acosta did to us. And if you have a player like that running around on both sides and Lionel Messi up the middle, right, you could be incredible.
Yep.
It feels like the one spot. Also, you could make an argument for a right back that was like Jordi Alba on the other side. You could make that argument. I think maybe you could make an argument for a true 6 that's like a real destroyer, like really high quality 6. Although I think I'd be a little hesitant on that one. But it does feel like center back's the obvious position. The most unobvious position, other than right winger and striker, is central midfielder, a number 8, a box-to-box. And we were just linked to Weston McKennie on Friday by a report in Italy who maybe we should finally talk about this because he is the person on the profile picture.
Thumbnail.
Thumbnail. Thank you. Does this make any sense? He's a great player. He's 25. He was Juventus's best midfielder. He led the team in assists. He's played in the Premier League. He's played in the Bundesliga. He's a really good player. But do we need a number 8? Like, is that how you use your DP spot?
And he's a versatile midfielder as well, right? He can play in multiple positions, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to feel about this particular move. It'll be great to have him on the roster and he'll be a starter immediately, but I'm not sure if that's how you want to use that DP position. Does he have the same level of impact as someone in the left wing spot, perhaps? I don't know. But yeah, I'm a little bit confused. You need to give me time to think about this one. Maybe when it does happen, that's when I'll feel happy about it.
I did an episode of The Heartbeat on Weston McKennie this morning. So if you guys want to go check that out and hear more about him, we're not going to talk about him too much because my ultimate conclusion is that this is just Juventus trying to drum up interest for this player. And they're using Inter Miami's name because they know they know Inter Miami is like an ambitious club that has sort of a worldwide recognition now. So I just think this is Juventus trying to drum up interest for a player that they're trying to move on who only has 1 year left on his contract. But I think as part of a bigger conversation about adding a DP, he's an interesting name to talk about because I agree with you. I don't think adding a number 8, a box-to-box midfielder makes sense for this team when that is the single position they have the most depth and talent in, although they won't for the Olympics and the Leagues Cup, but I don't think you bring in a DP just for the Leagues Cup. So where are we at with this conversation? It felt like you were in the beginning. Let's add a center back and see where we're at. And now it's let's add a DP center back and a U22 center back and a defensive midfielder and a number 10 and a left winger. And you know what? Throwing a right back for good measure. Where are we at with this summer transfer window? because it feels like it could be huge. It could be transformative. It could bring in 5 players and move out 2 or 3 players. Or it could just be bringing in 1 player and like we move out Nico Freire, who was done for the season anyways, and kind of call it a day. I came into this conversation very excited and very enthusiastic about the possibilities that Inter Miami has. Where are you now that we've sort of fleshed out this whole conversation?
Yeah, I came into this conversation very pragmatic and conservative about what Inter Miami is going to do in this particular transfer window. But the more I hear you talk, the more we discuss potential ways in which this team can be improved, the more confused I get. I'm not sure where this team is at and what's going to happen, but there's a lot of silence in terms of what our business looks like. Yes, we've been linked with a few players here and there, but not much is coming out in terms of what this management is trying to do with the squad. And that makes me think that maybe it's going to be a muted summer and maybe it's going to be a muted transfer window, because if we were looking to make that many changes across the board, there may have been a lot more links and rumors that we would have heard. But the transfer window hasn't opened yet. There's still a few days before we can actually churn up the rumor mill. So maybe we find out and get more clarity in the next week or so. But I agree. I think what this podcast has told us is that there are a few ways in which this transfer window can go. It can either be really, really exciting, or it's just a regular two in, two out sort of a transfer window. I hope you're right on this one, but we'll find out soon enough.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while now. It feels like this roster was set up, and as you kind of mentioned, it feels like it was set up to give us flexibility this window. And part of that's happenstance because of an injury to Frede, but you kept Franco Negri, and now you have him as a trade piece. You knew Diego Gomez is sort of on his way out potentially for a long time now. You knew you had 2 open roster slots. It's there for you if you want it, right?
Yeah.
You make a good point about not wanting to disrupt the team too much, how it could take some time. We saw even this season, it took 2 months for us to really get going. And I think when we go into next season and talk about the Champions Cup, that's going to be a big talking point. Is this team really ready to go from the beginning of the season in order to make a run in the continental tournament? But for this window, there could be a lot of exciting things. I've talked a lot. I've asked you a lot of questions. I've led a lot of this conversation, but I want to get your thoughts on like, what questions do you have? What questions are you interested in finding out over the next month while this window is open?
I want to see whether Tata Martino and the team is looking at this team the same way that we're looking at, right? And I think the 6-1 loss to Cincinnati and the quote that you mentioned from Tata saying that this team is potentially not even top 3 in the MLS is a good insight into that. But I want to understand what positions they're prioritizing, because I think you and me both have spoken for how this team is screaming for a number 6 and how this team is screaming for a center back and a central defender, right? And the way we use our DP spot, the way we use our U22 if it becomes available, the way we make this next transfer window applicable to this team will give us an insight as to how Tata Martino views the makeup of this team and what their understanding is. Because if, for instance, we don't go for an out-and-out center back, and if we go for just another, a regular Nico Freire replacement, that does give us a lot of insight into what Tata Martino's thinking. Maybe the thinking that we already have that big center back available in Ian Trey, for instance. So a few questions will be answered, I think, but we'll see.
Yeah, but everything, and part of the reason why I wanted to go back at the beginning of this episode to talk about what we did last summer, to talk about what we did last winter or this past winter, was to really show that this team has been incredibly ambitious. They've tried to max out what they could do. They have really gone for it in both windows. And so you are not alone in thinking this could be a muted transfer window where they might just replace an injured player. But that has not been what Inter Miami has shown us over the last year since Tata Martino and Lionel Messi committed to Inter Miami. They have shown us they are going to try and max out what they're capable of. They're going to try and max out their roster. They're going to fill out every designation they can in order to add talent. there are two things I want to talk about with the transfer window that are ancillary, but I think are worth the conversation. And before we wrap it up, the first, and I've mentioned this before, but maybe it was mostly on the heartbeat, not here. I'm a little interested to see how they can use this DP spot, because you have multiple veterans who took pay cuts to come to Inter Miami so that they wouldn't be filling up a DP spot, at least in Luis Suarez and Jordi Alba. Probably just those two guys that purposely took less money in order to allow Inter Miami to not have to use a DP spot on them, because Inter Miami didn't have DP spots on them. And so now that you open up another DP spot, are they going to be okay with Inter Miami going out and paying a lot of money to someone who's not their friend, who is just a talented piece, right? You know, Weston McKennie is the big name we've talked about, but will Jordi Alba and Luis Suarez be okay if we bring in Weston McKennie and pay him 3 times what we're paying Jordi Alba and Luis Suarez? That is a team chemistry question that we don't know the answer to, but it's something to consider. It's something that they're definitely going to consider, because they can't be okay with Jordi Alba and Luis Suarez being upset about that. So that's a huge question mark, a huge part of this conversation. And then the second part of this is we've almost exclusively recruited South Americans since Tata Martino came. Obviously, Jordi Alba and Sergio Busquets came from Barcelona with Lionel Messi. And Julian Gress was a guy Tata Martino already knew, but basically every other player has come from South America. And this is not the primary window for the South American leagues. It's the primary window for the European leagues. Do you think Inter Miami is going to attack the European window in the same way? Or do you think Tata Martino and Chris Henderson are going to shy away from that? Because you talk about being a muted transfer window. That to me seems like it could be the main reason we don't be aggressive, because not as many names are available from South America, whereas a lot of names are available in Europe, but maybe that's not how Tata Martino wants to build this team. And how would you feel about that if that's sort of how this ends up?
I hope that that's not the thinking, because I think regardless of nations and boundaries and continents, talent is available everywhere, right? And I know South American football is different. It has a similar style to the way they play in the MLS. And I think transition from South American football to the MLS is easier. Maybe I'm wrong with that. But there's still plenty of talented players available in Europe. And we wouldn't be linked to some of them if that wasn't the case, right? And it's all a matter of making sure that you look at the right talent profile, you look at the right availability. And I would hope that's not the thinking behind it. But yeah, you make a really good point. That could potentially be the case, because it seems like this team has been constructed to suit the coach and Lionel Messi in a way that, and that's perfectly fine. That's, you want to build a team that's able to adapt to your best players in the best possible manner. And yeah, the European market aspect could definitely be a consideration. But I do think there are still players available out there. They could be South American players as well who are playing in Europe. So that might be one consideration. But I don't think they will. If they're muted, I hope that's not the reason, because I think there's plenty of talent available in Europe.
Now, I will say, because this has been a talking point around Inter Miami over the last year since Tata came, they've done a really good job of talent identification. They haven't signed any busts like we have in the past when we went to Europe. Guys like Stefanelli and Coco Jean, and I don't need to name all the names, but there have been some players that haven't lived up to their price tag and the salary that we gave them. And so the fact that they're going to South America, but they're getting good deals, they're getting quality players that can positively impact the team, that aren't a salary drain. If that's how they have to do it, by using a coach that has great talent ID in South America, then that's okay. I understand that, and I don't have a problem with it, but just something to consider. Final thoughts on this transfer window before I talk about how crazy breeds crazy again.
Bring me some big names, man. Bring me every single big name in Europe, and I'll be a happy man. Please. McAllister, bring him in. Enzo Fernandez, bring him in. Garnacho, bring him in.
Are you more excited for this transfer window after this conversation than you were before this conversation?
Yeah, I think I am more excited about this transfer window after this conversation. I think you and I were on very different pages, but you made me see the light. No, I'm kidding. There's potential, man. There really is potential, but we'll see how it proceeds.
Something that every crazy person has said at least once. You have made me see the light. Okay, guys, that's it for us for tonight. We'll be back for the pregame show, as always, on Wednesday, 1 hour before the game. If you're listening to this on podcast app, that is only on YouTube, so I encourage you to join us. But, check it out, the Dry Pink Dialogue YouTube channel. If you're Chris Henderson and Tata Martino listening to this, guys, you have flexibility. You have this ability to go out and do these things. Show us that you want to be the best team, not just in the MLS this season, but the best team in MLS history, and go out and win those trophies. Guys, thank you so much for being a part of this. Thanks for being in the chat. We will see you guys next time, hopefully at the pregame show. Other than that, signing off. As always, I'm Scotty. I'm here with my co-host Saur, and we will see you guys next time. Have a wonderful night.